Let's start by comparing and contrasting data entry and management in our 4 export markets. All have multiple routes of data entry. All also have some type of electronic entry system. Frequently, they also have alternative methods, and that might be for different types of producers. For instance, there's batch entry for large numbers of movements, so large producers might utilize that situation. And there's also phone and forms that are for rare movements, or for old school movements, or people who have not yet adapted to the digital methods. We've also seen that there are different entry schemes. There's a double entry scheme, as we saw in Canada and Brazil. We also have a single entry scheme where we saw in Denmark, so that movement information only gets entered by one person once. And then in Australia, we saw the handoff entry, or the 3-part system where the sender enters information, the carrier enters different information, and the receiver enters even more information. It requires 3 people to sign off on that movement. The time from move to entry in the 4 systems varied between 2 days from the movement to 30 days between the movement. When it comes to repositories, we found that in all 4 systems, the movement data ends up in one repository that the national animal health officials can access. The movement data may pass through one or other repositories, though. For Brazil, it passed through the local and then the state before it got to the national. In Australia, there was a pre-repository for the industry association use, and then it passed to the national system. The movement data may also be duplicated and augmented for more certification needs with attribute-based traceability in non-government-based repositories for other trade needs. We saw that with the Australian system, as well as the Brazilian AgriTrace system that's not yet used for pork. Let's move on to governance. As we work through governance, the first part of governance really is access to the information. Who can access that information? In general, officials in all 4 organizations can access that information for administration and operation of the program, and for contact tracing and veterinary preparedness. There are some nuances to who can access the databases. In Denmark, producers can access the data in order to add, edit, and delete their own movements. There can also be registered users that can access the database in order to research specific sites or CRH numbers. But when they get information out of the database, the privately identifying information is not returned. Things like emails and phone numbers in specific locations, that's not returned. But they can understand the volume of movements from a specific place. And finally, in Denmark, the public can access the database. They can use the data in order to understand aggregated import-export volumes and the countries with which Denmark is importing or exporting pork from. In Brazil, the industry-based AgriTrace system accesses the information to certify that a product meets a customer's need, whether that customer be a Brazilian customer or an export market. In Australia, the initial repository managed by the industry group can also be used to understand national production volumes, can be used to administer levy payments or indemnity payments as we would know it in the United States. They do this as a service to the government. And it can be used for disease outbreaks that are of a local or industry concern, not a national concern. Let's move on to the checks and balances. In Canada, the checks and balances include estimates of the number of producers participating and the number of movements from place to place. They compare that against what is known about the Canadian industry. And they may also provincially do outbreak simulations in order to assess how well the program is working. In Denmark, they have automatic control systems in place that help with validation, and they've got follow-up procedures when things are out of spec. They also require a 1 time per year confirmation or correction of the CHR information by each producer for each site or facility. In Brazil, compliance is regularly checked by independent inspectors. Over 4,700 local agricultural health offices are responsible for the regular update of farms registration, proper documentation, and timely vaccination. The Australian Industry Group has a few more checks and balances in place. First of all, their quality assurance program requires participation in PigPass. They also have a unique serial ID that is used for each movement or national vendor declaration. They have a few other things that are maybe more financially important. For instance, The industry system is the system that the government uses to verify levy payments or indemnity payments. So it is important for the producer to make sure their information is entered and is accurate. And finally, the abattoirs, or the receivers of pigs at harvest, they are required to have complete documentation, or they themselves are fined. So they would be less likely to accept those pigs into market if they do not have the required information. So as we wrap up this video series, we learned that traceability is a bit of a blanket term, and it can have different contexts. In some cases, it's logistics in understanding where a product goes from point A to point B. And in other cases, it's got attribute components to it in understanding how or what processes a product went through in order to create it. We learned that traceability systems have three components: the data entry and management, and then the governance of that information. Of the traceability systems that I've evaluated, all four had a single repository that the federal animal health officials could access, and some also had other repositories for different uses. As we look at traceability systems, understanding and balancing the needs and wants of all stakeholders is critical for the success of any system. The goal of the traceability system is to build trust and consumer confidence. Perfection is not required within the system, but for the system to work, participation is.